little light has gone on, so we're recording. So I'd like to say a huge hello to everybody who's watching. And I am just so thrilled that today I'm going to be talking to Jake Hope, who I've admired for years and years and years. And I'm very lucky because I count him as a friend. He's a reading development and children's book consultant, critic, author, blog editor for Youth Libraries Group, and chair of the Yoto Carnegies Working Party. But actually, he is so, so much more than that. And we all consider Jake one of the unsung heroes of the children's book world. He was voted one of the top 10 librarians of the future. I think that's a bit rude. Isn't that a bit rude, Jake? I mean, you're not of the future, you're of the now.
That was a long time ago. I think probably I'm one of the past ones now.
Rubbish. No, no, no. And you were also reading and learning development manager for Lancashire County Council. And also in 2020, you published the book. It's called Seeing Sense, and I can't recommend it highly enough. It's just brilliant. It's a visual literacy as a tool for libraries, learning and reader development. And we're going to be talking a lot about libraries. And my local library has got two copies now. And yeah, so I would recommend that very highly. But anyways, welcome, Jake, and thank you so, so much for talking to us at Picture Hooks.
It's a real pleasure to be here. And yeah, I've certainly admired the work that Picture Hooks are doing. I think, yeah, you're doing some fantastic stuff. And I think the role of illustration feels incredibly important and sometimes a little overlooked. So yeah, power to your elbow.
No, I think that's true. In fact, children's picture books don't, well, children's books generally don't get reviewed often enough, as I'm sure we'll talk about later. But very few reviewers mention the illustrator. I think Sarah McIntyre's doing a lot of work on that. But to begin at the beginning, when did you first become interested in picture books? And also, what books did you love as a child?
So I think right from early childhood, I was very interested in books and reading. I was the youngest of four children. So librarians often talk about how they can't remember a time when they couldn't read. For me, I could remember very clearly when I couldn't read because my siblings could all read and I couldn't. So actually reading was something that I really wanted to do, and I enjoyed sharing books with my brother and my sisters. And in terms of which books I really enjoyed, when I was growing up, there was an illustrator called Quentin Blake, and his first
Oh,
book, Patrick, was a great favourite of mine, all about a man who discovers a little fiddle on a market stall. And when he goes and plays this fiddle, all sorts of magical things happen. Huge, colourful fish sort of come up, and there are trees dripping with buttered toast and jelly and ice cream, all sorts of really wonderful, sensual things happening that really appealed to me as a child. And I think another one that I absolutely loved was called Wide Awake Jake. And at the time, Jake was not that common a name, so it was quite unusual to come across a Jake in a book or even another child named Jake. So I loved this book because it felt like I was a little bit seen.
I remember both of those with great fondness, particularly Wide Awake Jake. There was something really magical about that book, I think. And
Yes.
still occasionally available in libraries, I think, which is one of the wonderful things about libraries is that books, their life continues there when they're very much off the bookshelves in bookshops. Can you just very briefly give us a sort of a bird's eye view of your career path up to where you are now?
Yeah, so it's been quite an unusual career path, I suppose, in many ways. So when I was at university, I went to York University and studied English and related literature. And I have to admit, I found it very, very frustrating. It was a very traditional course, and we were taken through from sort of Old English right the way up to modernism. We were actively discouraged from looking at any critical theory. I found it quite limiting, I suppose. But one of the joys was that Marjorie Fisher, children's book critic Marjorie Fisher, had left her collection to York University Library. So there was this huge sort of array of children's books and past Carnegie and Kate Greenaway winners, which I was able to delve into and enjoy. So I did a lot of reading of children's books whilst I was there. I then went on to specialise and did an MA in international children's literature at Reading. And I suppose I always thought that I would end up working in London because that's where most of the children's book jobs tended to be. But I was very lucky in that a job looking after the Lancashire Book of the Year Award, one of the oldest regional book awards, came up, and that was where I'd sort of grown up. So it felt lovely to be able to be back there and to be able to give a little bit back to the service that I'd gained so much from, really. Whilst I was working for Lancashire, I did a lot of networking and discussing with different authors and different publishers, which led me to do different bits and pieces of work with different groups. And then all of the cuts began to hit libraries quite hard, sadly. And it became easier to support libraries from the outside than it felt to be able to do that from the inside. Libraries tend to be quite caught up in local politics and you're very restricted by what you can do if you're working for libraries. So it was nice to then go outside libraries and to be able to do some work. I spent a year working on a children's book website called The Wood of Words and did lots of work with promoting reading through that. And then gradually just built up my freelance career, became involved with the Carnegies again, which was a real joy. And yeah, here I am now.
I love the fact that there's that the thread of the children's books all the way through. I mean, we're talking specifically, I think, here about picture books because
Yeah.
that's where Picture Hooks is coming from. So quite often people dismiss picture books. You describe to you yourself what is the importance of a child being given access to picture books.
Yeah, so I think it's the first time when you're able to see yourself as a reader. And I think one of the great things about sort of classic picture books is there's often a very imaginative relationship between how the words and the pictures are working. So the words might be telling you one thing and the pictures might be showing something quite different, or might be allowing a visual reader to see and anticipate what's happening. So it can be a very empowering experience. It can be the first time that you really feel yourself to be a reader. And I think there's all kinds of, yeah, dynamism in terms of how that relationship works, which can make you feel very actively involved and engaged. And there's a whole anatomy to how picture books work. So the idea of page turns and building up a sense of anticipation. When I'm doing training with the Carnegie judges, one of the books that I often use is Rosie's Walk, which actually only has about 32 words in it. And if you read those 32 words, it's actually a really, really dull story about just walking around a farm. But the moment that you have the illustrations there, Pat Hutchins' wonderful sort of folk artsy illustrations, there's a whole other narrative going on with the fox and with Rosie. And you don't know whether Rosie is sort of full of cunning and guile and is leading the fox into all sorts of situations. So I think it really enables us to experience the way literature and stories work and immerse ourselves within that.
It's interesting because you use the word reader. When I'm talking about picture books, I talk about sharing, or because when it comes to the pictures, I think it's almost absorbing a picture book story that small children do. I think you're right that it is learning to read pictures, but I don't know when I do work with, I'm sure when you do too, with kind of very small children, it's just that connection between them and the picture, and it shows them a world that they may not know or very often don't know in the visual sense.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with that. And I suppose from my perspective, one of the reasons why I use the term read is because I think there has culturally been a bit of a tendency to see illustrations as a stepping stone towards standard literacy. And I
Yeah.
think it's far more than that. And actually, I think if we start to talk about reading and illustrations as part of a reading journey, it's something then that hopefully we don't have to give up. We can continue that. And I think if we're talking about sort of healthy reading diets and balance, I think that's not just about sequential reading. It's about going back, it's about rereading, it's about exploring different formats and different techniques.
I think you're right about that. People, a lot of people see picture books as a stepping stone towards what they call proper reading. And I'm fascinated by the fact that graphic novels and books. So many more books are now being published with pictures. And there's this term piction that seems to be floating around at the moment, which is a kind of, I mean, they've been around for ages. It's just a term that has been reinvented, I think. They're like early chapter books, but they're very, very highly illustrated.
Yeah, for me, I think one of the important things about illustrations is children and young people who are growing up now are going to be part of a world where information comes in many different forms. And we're using visual literacy as a base for almost every digital device. Really, right from the beginning, our experiences with illustration are giving us an awareness and an aptitude towards that. And I think one of the things that we miss when we start to see illustration as just being a stepping stone towards standard literacy is that actually we're not getting that kind of multimodal view. And actually, I think for being a part of the modern world, that feels really important at the minute.
Yeah, absolutely. I was talking with a group of children just the other week about really about the thing about reading picture books and then being expected to move on as if it was a better thing to chapter books. And I said, well, I thought that was really unfair because, I mean, adults all watch TV, and it's rather like saying to an adult, well, you can't watch TV anymore, you've got to just listen to the radio. Whereupon some child said, what's radio? So we had another discussion, and I said, well, how would you describe a book without pictures? And one of them said, well, Viv, he said, it's like toast without the jam and butter. So
Oh,
which I thought was really, really nice. And I mean, I think the world of illustration is just so extraordinary because there are so many subjects, aren't there, that you can deal with in a picture book, like John Burningham's Grandpa, which actually deals about death. But if you put it in an early chapter book, people would go, oh, no, 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 you can't talk about that. But why do you think it is that we can deal with these huge themes of birth and death and sibling rivalry and being ignored and left out in a picture book?
I think that's a really interesting question, and it's a little bit like those cake mixes where you just add the egg. And I suppose the reader is a little bit like the egg in this scenario. And you used the term about absorbing pictures earlier. And I think there's a real intimacy with picture books when they're being shared on a one-to-one level between whether it's parents or whether it's teachers and a child. There can be a real intimacy. So they're actually perfect for conversation starters because you can see what's happening, you can ask questions, you can explore, and you can do all of that at your own pace and according to the level at which you kind of are developmentally at that point.
And silent books, I mean, they're beginning to get far, I mean, they're far more popular now than they used to be. And but I do think a lot of adults are put off silent books because they don't know how to read them, or absorb them or whatever, particularly when they're sharing them with a child. I mean, would you agree with that?
I completely agree with that. And I think actually one of the things that tends to happen as a consequence of that stepping stone approach with illustration is unfortunately, as adults, you often find people lose their confidence in encountering illustration and in talking about what happens in illustration. We find this a huge amount when we're sort of training the judges for the Carnegie Medal for Illustration, what used to be the Kate Greenaway Medal, that actually there's a lot of enthusiasm and interest, but there's also a great underconfidence in how to talk about this. And one of the things that we try to encourage is there is specific terminology that you can be using. So you might be talking about the gutters, which happen in the middle of a picture book where the binding is.
Mhm.
But actually, the most important thing, rather than that specific terminology and jargon, is to say what you see and how that's impacting on the telling of the story in a visual way.
Yeah. No, absolutely. I mean, I teach, well, not so much now, but I talk a lot about illustration at the Edinburgh College of Art. And we talk a lot about how eye contact within pictures is so important and movement, and that the fact that a picture book moves on the whole, from left to right, and what happens if a character stops and faces from right to left, and how that actually visually halts the action. And but it's so subliminal that I think a lot of adults don't realize that that's what's happening. When you're talking and you're training librarians, I mean, how can you connect with them on that kind of thing?
So what we tend to do is we appoint our judges more or less a year before they're actually starting the process of judging, where we're introducing them to a range of different stories, information books, different types of illustrated works, and we're then talking them through those. So we'll actually have mock judgings where we'll focus on a particular title and we'll have a very in-depth discussion as to how that's working, which areas are successful and which aren't. And I think your point about characters sort of flowing in the direction of reading is a really, really important one. It's a bit like going with the grain of a wood or
Yeah.
going against that, and it can have a really big impact on readers.
Mm. How do you think one can extend that kind of visual knowledge to parents and carers and people who, aren't don't have the good fortune to be trained by you?
My hope would be that by training up more of our librarians as judges, is that that then helps to equip them. In my view, everyone who becomes a judge for the Carnegies hopefully learns really useful CPD skills that they're then able to go and take and use in their professional practice, and they're able to share and disseminate on a much, much wider level with the schools, with the families and the communities that they're then working with.
That takes us on really to the question of librarians in libraries and librarians in schools. I mean, so many libraries are being cut. So many librarians who have specialization in children's books are being given other roles. And I mean, how many primary schools have a dedicated librarian? I mean, what can be done about that?
Yeah, it's a real problem. There's lots of talk happening at the moment about every primary school having a library.
Mhm.
On the surface, that sounds really, really positive and hopeful. But I think as much as we have a space as a library, it's really important that there's a librarian there who's able to open up that world of books and reading. There's a poem called The Caxtons and Mechanical Birds, and it's all about books as birds and sort of opening up and flying. And I think it's really important that books are open. If they're
Mm.
not, it's just a screen or a wall of sort of, yeah, barriers really. And actually, what we need to be doing is making that into doorways or portals that people can then access and gain the benefits from. It's important to recognize what the library is and to really uphold some of those values. So there are four S's which are sometimes talked about when it comes to libraries, which is space, so the actual library space that's there, stock, what's inside the library, services, how you're using all of that together, and then staff, who's overseeing all of that and bringing it all together, almost like a conductor in an orchestra, I guess.
Yeah, yes. So if there's somebody watching just at this precise moment in time who has something to do with their school library, how would you suggest that they make the books more accessible to children? How should they display the books? How can they make these books really, really appeal?
So I think there are some really, really basic things that sometimes get overlooked. So actually having books, what we call front on, so that you're showing the covers, that can be really, really impactful, and particularly with promotions and displays, because if you're just seeing the spines, actually you get no real sense of what that book is about. And a lot of time and expertise goes into cover design. As much as sometimes people say don't judge a book by its cover, we all do, and it's a really, really useful guide. I think that first impression as you walk into a library, what's on display, what are your sight lines, what are you seeing immediately? And I always try to encourage libraries to put some really engaging new stock as the first thing that people are seeing, and to keep that rotating so that people get to see different things each time that they're coming in, and that it feels exciting and vibrant and something that you want to engage with and be part of.
I was reading just recently about, now I have to look up the term, it's called neuroarchitecture. And this is changing the reading spaces in schools so that instead of having a square room, room with a sort of box with books all the way around, that there are all kinds of little kind of cubby holes and spaces where you can go and curl up and read. And they were saying that actually this really does promote a sense of comfort, and therefore reading levels in schools and libraries that have gone in for that kind of architecture, it really has made a difference.
I think that's very true, and it's a bit like a map, I suppose. We like to discover things, and reading is a journey of discovery. And if we can amplify that across the experience of browsing and engaging with books, I think that has to be a really, really positive thing. We want to be encouraging people to have as many positive associations with books, reading, stories as we possibly can. One of the things I talk about a little bit in Seeing Sense is the importance of physical environments in libraries and bookshops. And in America, particularly, there tends to be what they call concept bookshops. So you might have a children's section which is themed around a particular concept illustrator or illustrated books. So it might be, say, that if you're familiar with Colin Thompson's work, the illustrator Colin Thompson, you would have the whole of the children's area built up like one of his wonderful sort of views of bookshelves which lead into different worlds and different areas. And I think that idea of concept libraries is a really interesting one, so that we are kind of encouraging that relationship much more. And I think different areas of the world have sort of experimented with this a little bit. I know Singapore have what they call their treehouse library, and they've built an entire library to look like a treehouse using recycled objects. So there's plastic bottles, all sorts of things. And it's an incredible experience that really wows you from the moment you step foot in there.
I've always thought libraries and librarians are just one of the great gifts that we have in this life.
Yeah.
Can you talk us through if you were judging a book?
Yeah, so with the Carnegie Medal for Illustration, it is about it. We're primarily looking at the illustrations, but as part of that, you are looking at the synergy with the text, and you're looking at how that relationship is working. One of the things that we have to be very, very careful about, and it's something which I've sort of changed some of the criteria for the awards a little bit with this in mind, is that I think because librarians are so used to and comfortable with the written word, quite often they will focus a lot on the written word and on fonts. And sometimes those conversations tend to dominate over the conversations around the illustration. So, whilst we've got that as a consideration, we do say that these are things that aren't always in the aegis of the illustrator, and that actually the judging panel needs to be aware of that fact and needs to be making a decision as to how important, in terms of the overall visual experience of the book, those elements are. And we've tried to structure the criteria, which are all available on the website, that we're very transparent about how we do this. We've tried to structure them in such a way that hopefully it helps to guide people, because we know that sometimes some of the librarians might feel a little bit less confident, and they might appreciate sort of being walked through the criteria a little bit more.
I do quite a lot of talks about picture books, and I was at Granite Noir Festival recently, and we were looking at the end papers for Benji Davis's The Storm Whale, and I was saying that a lot of people just whiz past the end papers. And when you work with illustrators, you realize how much time and thought goes into them. And in particular, the storm whale is a great example, because if you look at the front end papers and then you look at the back end papers, you can actually really tell what the story arc is going to be. And I really love that. But how does one persuade people to look at a book as a holistic object, not just as whizzing past? I mean, even title pages will, in fact, give you a massive number of clues as to what's going on.
They do, and this is something that we're really trying to encourage as judges to do, is not just to whiz through, but to really take their time and explore the books, even to the extent of sort of removing the dust jackets from hardbacks
Yeah.
and looking at what's underneath those, because quite often there can be hidden elements
Yes.
that again reveal a great deal about the shape of the visual story, and do all kinds of foregrounding. We're wanting them to delve deep and really explore all of the mechanics of how the story is being shown, really.
And what are your thoughts on, I mean, again, because I work a lot with publishers, I've heard that recently they're looking particularly for more kind of traditional styles of illustration so that you can see the mark making, you can see the fact that it is not AI generated. I mean, do you have any preferences between or any thoughts on digital versus traditional styles of illustration?
I would be personally, I'd be wary about pitching them against each other too much. I do enjoy mark making, and I suppose it's a little bit like going to an old house where you can see how it's been conserved. I think that's an important part of the overall journey. So I enjoy that in illustrations. I think there are some examples of really, really fine craftsmanship in terms of digital art as well, but there are also some very um, lazy digital art where techniques that I suppose particular filters do are being overused, and that feels a bit of a shame. I think our artwork carries our own DNA. It's a bit like a thumbprint, and I think we need to be a bit careful about erasing our thumbprints.
What do you think when illustrators are working? Because I mean, a large proportion of our audience will be illustrators. What do you think who in particular should they be thinking of when they're creating their work?
I suppose it's a case of finding what works for you, but personally, when I'm writing, I find it a bit difficult to hold an idea of target audience in mind. And instead, it's more about thinking about the overall story and the impact you want that to have, and the way the characters are kind of contributing to that. So for me, it's more about that rather than trying to sort of think about a particular audience member. And I think the danger is if you try to think of a particular age group of child, I suppose you're in danger of homogenizing, and children are very, very different in how they feel and think. And I think what you're always trying to do is find those big universal truths that everyone can feel a little bit ignited by.
I mean, the question of diversity has been very much in discussion over the last few years. And one or two illustrators that I've spoken to have said that they feel that there is less support at the moment for diversity in picture books than there was maybe 4 or 5 years ago. Is that something that you would agree with?
I think probably it is. So I think there was a big push for diversity around the time when the Centre for Literacy and Primary Education began their Reflecting Realities survey, where they were looking at the sort of representation across children's books. And then I think we saw that continue partly because of what happened in America with George Floyd and the massive sort of movement around that. And then I think since then we've seen a bit of a dieback happening. And I think we need to, as an industry, in my view, we need to be really working very hard to uphold diversity and inclusion, particularly in these divided, politicized times, because this is the reality of the world that we're growing up in. And I think picture books can help to support understanding and empathy and yeah.
Mm. Oh, agreed. No, absolutely. No, it's something that's been worrying me recently in that, and it did feel like it was really coming into the foreground, and I was thinking, yes, at last. And then there's a sort of certain amount of dieback, which I think is a real shame. And we're very nearly coming to the end of our time, but I just wanted to ask you, I mean, picture books, well, children's books generally, I mean, they're hardly ever reviewed. I mean, there are roundups, and then there's things like the best picture books of 2025 or whatever. I mean, what can be done about that, if anything?
Yeah, it's a really difficult question to answer. I think unfortunately we're not, although in the UK we've got this wonderful sort of history and heritage of picture book creation, we're not very good at actually valuing that and continuing to draw focus to it. And that feels a real missed opportunity. I think we are lucky in that there are lots of blogs that are doing some of this work on places like Instagram. There are various educational influencers who are doing a lot around this. So I suppose supporting all of that feels very, very important. I wish that there was more in the mainstream because I think one of the challenges that we have in terms of children's reading is the sheer number of books that are being published every year. I think in the UK we publish about, well, over 9,000 children's books annually. And navigating through that for anybody is hugely difficult. So I think there is a real role for reviewing, but unfortunately, you have to delve a bit harder than the mainstream newspapers, media publications. There are places that do it. So things like Books for Keeps do some fantastic work. And you can also access a huge database of past titles and reviews there. And then there are newer organizations like Inclusive Books for Children who are doing a lot of work on reviewing titles. They're doing it specifically from an inclusion and diversity angle. But again, a really good way of helping to amplify some of that.
I mean, in Scotland, we have this thing, reading schools, and that's very much about encouraging children to read for fun and for interest, and because it's an enjoyable thing to do. And not only are the children encouraged to do that, but they are encouraged to take possession of the theme and go out to local businesses, the dentist, the local doctor, the local shops, and say, "What are you reading?" And yeah, so it is kind of what can we do really basically is to raise the profile, particularly of children's picture books, because I mean it's just so important.
It is hugely important, and I think you're absolutely right. One of the big problems that we have, if you speak to any reader, one of the things that really enthuses them is freedom of choice.
Mm.
And I think when it comes to supporting and encouraging reading, a lot of the time we do that through a lens of purpose. So it's about education or it's about attainment and achievement. And actually, I think that that area of discovery and of fun, it's hugely, hugely important. And I think that's far more what we need to be trying to encourage from the outset rather than getting hung up on the outcomes. It feels a little bit like we're constantly putting the proverbial cart before the horse.
Yes, absolutely. And I mean, you've been brilliant to talk to, Jake, and I'm going to really throw something at you. I'm going to say, is there a recent picture book that you have read that you really, really love and you think everybody should go straight out there and borrow, buy, go to the library and get a copy? And just while you're thinking, I'll give you a moment or two thinking time. I'll actually recommend a book that I picked up at our local bookshop just recently, and it's called Because of a Shoe, and it's illustrated by the amazing Marla Frazee, who I absolutely love her books, and it's written by Julie Foliano, and it's a quite incredible picture book, and I love it. So, what would you recommend?
I think one of the ones, it's always hard just picking one book, but one of the ones that I'd recommend, which is quite recent, which I think is doing something really interesting, is Don't Trust Fish, illustrated by Dan Santat. And there's a lot in it about misinformation and what we're kind of encouraged to think and believe, but it's done in a really, really humorous way. Lots and lots of caricatures of different types of fish and underwater aquatics. And yeah, it's a really fun book, but at the same time, there is that kind of undercurrent of message that's coming through, which I think makes you think, which leaves a message that lasts a long time.
I love the I love the fact that you used the word undercurrent when it's called Don't Trust Fish. But
Yes, I noticed that I was, yeah, in danger of punning
Is there anything else particularly that you would like to say to all the people watching at the moment, all the authors, illustrators, maybe majority will be illustration led. Anything that you would like to tell them from your position, because they'll listen to you.
Well, I think the main thing really is keep doing what you're doing, remain interested in picture books. I think the more all of us can create critical mass around picture books, the better for everybody. And I think we shouldn't be turning people away, whatever age, background, or ability level. Picture books bring people together, they unite. And I think the world could really benefit from more of that at the moment.